ekonomiskas darbības, attiecīgi, kas vērstas ir, lai ierobežotu un apturētu un novērstu Krievijas pretiesisko iebrukumu Ukrainā un arī Baltkrievijas atbalstošās darbības šīm rīcībām. Un visa informācija, kas šobrīd ir, liecina, ka šīs sankcijas drīzā laikā nevar tikt atceltas. Līdz ar to tas nav, ka mēs varam pāris nedēļas vai mēnešus, tā teikt, pārziemot šos te ierobežojumus un tad jau cerēt, ka drīzā laikā saimnieciskā darbība pagriezīsies tāpat, kā bija. Visticamāk, ka joprojām teorētiski varētu notikt saimnieciskā darbība, darījumi ar Krievijas juridiskajām personām un Baltkrievijas, taču arī šie atsevišķie gadījumi ir kaut pat reti ļoti, un arī tad, kad ir iespējami šie darījumi tīri tehniski, tīri juridiski varbūt, tad var būt ļoti daudz praktiskas problēmas, kad šos darījumus nevar izpildīt, piemēram, otrās puses banka ir iesaldēta, vai arī, piemēram, Krievijas valsts ir pieņēmusi kādus iekšējos ierobežojumus, kādi šobrīd ir noteikti. Līdz ar to
in force. So, short term, the situation most probably won't revert to what was enforced before by the sanctions. And peace in Ukraine is essential in order to restore eventual business operations. Even when the actions are possible between Latvia or other countries and Russia and Belarus, there are hindrances. A few words about the types of sanctions. One type of sanctions is target sanctions. There are specific restrictions against legal and natural persons concerning the property and companies controlled by these persons, the companies, the factories, banks. Another type of restriction which is frequently encountered, the so-called sectoral sanctions against goods and services exported from Belarus and Russia. Sales in the territory of Russia. All these restrictions apply when, for example, you have stock storage in Russia, you cannot sell from there. There are these types of restrictions. There are also indirect sanction risks. For example, even when the goods are being delivered, for example, to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, or another country which is located close to Russia, but the final destination of the goods is Russia, and this is a sanctioned type of goods, then this type of transaction would be a violation of the sanctions. There's also a very recent category of the sanctions, which we had not had before. These are sanctions against persons from Russia and Belarus who are non-residents of the EU, who don't have a residence permit in the countries of the EU or the European Economic Zone or Switzerland, so the restrictions apply. also to the companies owned by such persons in the territory of the EU. Now, a few more words about these restrictions in order to paint a bigger picture. What are the risks created by the sanctions? But I won't go into great detail because we would be spending hours discussing specific restrictions. There are specific natural persons and legal entities who have been sanctioned. You can find the list of them on the web page I'm mentioning on the slide. And the list of companies where such persons on occupied permanent positions can be found. So you can extrapolate that the sanctions apply. Also trade with the occupied Crimea, so Stopol, Luhansk, and Donetsk is restricted. Of course, it's hard to imagine that any type of trade would be even possible in these territories, but it's obvious that right now the trade has been prohibited. It is also prohibited to export to Russia directly or indirectly dual-use goods and technology, as well as goods and technology that can be used in defense and security. And there are different categories of goods and technology for use in the aerospace industries, in maritime navigation, iron and steel products. Not all iron and steel products have fallen under sanctions, but in the regulations you can find the customs codes, and the representative of the customs is going to go into greater detail on that. There is a range of iron and steel products which have been banned for import and export to Russia. So a part of these products are prohibited from imports into the EU, and most of them are banned from exports. Luxury goods valued at 300 euros per unit, including clothing, cosmetics, beauty products, alcohol, as well as, for example, mobile phones with a value exceeding 750 euros per unit. This also applies to sports equipment, car, luxury car equipment, spare parts, which perhaps not even amount to 300 euros, but they are banned. So there is a wide range of goods which cannot be exported to Russia. And if you have them in storage already in the territory of Russia, it is forbidden to sell them. And there will be a few additional comments on that, because as you can see, the sanctions are quite vast. When the warfare in Ukraine intensified and the war crimes against the state of Ukraine were becoming more frequent, the sanctions became harsher. And in the Annex 23 to EU Regulation 833/2014, there is a ban on roses, rhododendrons, chalk, clay, clothing, including second-hand paint, pigments, paper, chemicals, textiles, equipment. You could spend 20 minutes just listing all the items which can no longer be exported to Russia. There's another list of what imports from Russia are prohibited. There is a transition period until August for this to fully come into effect, but this applies to different raw materials, wood, cement, different fertilizers, different fibers, furniture, and parts thereof. These imports are prohibited from Russia. And you can follow the customs codes, because they explain what categories of goods fall under the sanctions. For example, when it comes to wood, it is an umbrella category that is covered, and there are other categories under that. Customs representative is going to go into greater detail about that. It is prohibited to invest in the energy sector in Russia or to participate in projects co-financed by the Russian Direct Investment Fund. All aircraft registered in Russia or owned or controlled by Russian legal and natural persons shall be prohibited from entering EU airspace and airfields. Several Russian media have been stripped of their broadcasting rights in the EU. Cooperation with these companies has been prohibited. These are specific companies listed in Annex 19, so not all companies, but a lot of Russian companies are in this list. A lot of banks have been directly sanctioned. These are not just EU sanctions, but also the US sanctions. A number of Russian banks have been included in the list of the US sanctions, and the Latvian financial sector observes the US sanctions pertaining to the bank sector. So transactions with these banks have been prohibited, even if your partner is not under sanctions, but their bank account is in the sanctioned bank. This means that the transactions become impossible. It is also important to note that operations with financial instruments are prohibited, and it is prohibited to use Russian flag vessels. They are banned from docking in EU ports, and this restriction also applies to those vessels that have changed flag after February 24th. Russian hauliers are also prohibited from importing goods into the EU, including in transit. This was a quick overview of the sanctions against Russia, but it's clear that these sanctions are very vast. They could be easily compared with the sanctions imposed against North Korea, but North Korea is very much cut off from the world economy. Russia, until now, has been directly involved in international trade, and so these vast sanctions against Russia shall doubtless influence the world more than the sanctions against North Korea, even though legally they are very similar. As regards Belarus, the situation is very similar, but the sanctions have been tailored to the specifics of the situation in Belarus. Natural persons are banned from association with Belarus, and also legal persons. It is also permitted to deliver directly or indirectly goods and technology, which can be used to strengthen military and technological capacity to develop the defense and security sector. There are technologies which hadn't been under license previously, but which can be used for military purposes. So it applies to these types of equipment and technology. There were sanctions against the Lukashenko regime, considering the repressions against the civil society and the opposition, and those sanctions are still in force. This means that the sanctions against importing technology, tobacco goods, those are still in force. It is also prohibited during this transition period for the sanctions to import and export different types of goods. There are some transition periods that run out on June the 1st, some on July the 1st. For the Russian coal, it's August, and for public tenders, public procurement procedures, the deadline is October, I think. So you have to take into account that there are different transition periods for the contracts which had been signed before the sanctions. This applies to steel works, certain rubber products, and mostly tires, pneumatic tires. It's prohibited to import them from Belarus. All aircraft registered in Belarus or owned or controlled by Belarusian legal natural persons are prohibited from using EU airspace, just like with the Russian aircraft. There are also sanctions against the Belarusian banks and Belarusian holders. There are some groups of sanctions which had not existed before. Sanctions against the so-called non-residents. These are the citizens of Russia and Belarus and legal entities which were founded in those countries. These persons cannot have more than 100 euros in a single account with a single credit institution. And there are also a number of other restrictions. For example, these persons cannot participate in public procurement in Latvia and in Baltic countries. There's a transition period which applies to the contracts which had been signed prior to April 9th, but the transition period runs out in autumn of this year. But it's not possible to make new agreements regarding public procurement in Latvia and in the EU anymore. This applies not just to these persons, but also to the companies owned by such persons. For example, in such cases when there are subcontractors who are covering a part of the procurement, the sanctions apply, and this cannot be done. In order to navigate this vast sanctions landscape, you have to have a structured approach. This is why the Financial Industry Association has published on its webpage the list of 5 steps for companies in order to implement a systemic approach to applying sanctions. I won't repeat these 5 steps, you can look them up. And our colleagues from Bloor Bank in the presentation we'll have later shall share more insights about how the procedure for following the sanctions within the company should be carried out so that the sanctions can be observed as much as possible. In conclusion, I would like to underline that circumvention of sanctions is a violation of sanctions. Therefore, the export or import of prohibited goods from Russia and Belarus via third countries, Russia's neighboring countries, with the aim of delivering them in the territory of Russia legally is considered to be a violation of sanctions. I invite you to take this into account. Even if you check that everything is fine from the point of view of the EU and US sanctions, there are some restrictions imposed by Russia itself in its own territory. This applies to the amount of money that can exit Russia, not in Russian currency, and there are persons registered in Russia who are getting these transactions from the EU. They are converted from euro into rubles, so there are different internal restrictions, and this can impact the operations. And finally, you have to take into account that payments with Russia and Belarus, given these different restrictions, have become particularly complex and time-consuming for businesses and for banks, and also for the state institutions such as customs. Therefore, those payments and transactions which are still allowed to take place between EU and Russia and Belarus take a lot of time, and you should assess whether there is a positive outcome from this type of cooperation, these types of transactions. I would also like to underline that the entrepreneurs are responsible for ensuring that their activities comply with the sanctions. Businesses are bearing the brunt of responsibility for observing the sanctions and the other regulations. This applies to Latvia and to all Baltic states. All persons are obliged to comply with the EU sanctions. This means that if within business operations the question arises, they must comply with the sanctions. This applies to the EU entrepreneurs, to Latvian entrepreneurs. The EU sanctions are binding for third countries. So if a Latvian company has another branch or daughter company in Russia and Belarus, the sanctions also apply. That would be all from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to give the floor to the next speaker. Thank you. There are questions from the audience. Unfortunately, the signal quality is very poor and we cannot hear the question. The speaker says, "I'm sorry, Laima, I cannot hear you. I will repeat the question the way I understood it, and you'll correct me if I misheard something. Regarding the deliveries to Russia, those which had been planned for Russia before are now being made to Turkey. Have I understood you correctly?" The comment is made off microphone. Unfortunately, there is no incoming signal. The speaker says, "I'm sorry, Laima, I think your microphone is off." The speaker's microphone is off. We'll have to drop this question. Hopefully, we'll be able to return to this topic in future presentations. Thank you, Saiva. We continue with the next speaker. I would like to give the floor to the representative of the Export Control Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Nauris Rumpe, head of the Export Control Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is going to provide an explanation of the types of goods included in the sanctions and their identification. Unfortunately, the signal quality is very poor and it is impossible to hear the speaker.
Šodien parādīšu, esam nedaudz kā izveidās skārts, vienkārši jūs zināt, jūs iekšā un rādīt variantus, materiālus, lai būtu vizuāli redzams, kas tās un precēm tādām precēm. Vissarežģītāk saukstā ir ļoti variants tīklām.
Unfortunately, the signal quality is too poor and we cannot hear the speaker.
līdz ar to ļoti daudz, ļoti sasīja to pēc, vienkārši ikdienas nav paredzētas, man liekas, varīgs, ka ir jāpārdod, ka ir jāpārdod, ka ir jāpārdod. Viena no lietām, kā vajadzētu paņemt, vai nepārēst, muitas darbu, gan mūsu darbu ikdienā, tieši iedzināšanās, lai tās varētu būt laiks, sūtīt uz Krieviju, Baltkrieviju, kas nav nopērkums, kas nav nopērkums, vienkārši paskaroties, vai tā nav kaut kāds stāvības plēs, ko mēs pašreiz, tas nav kaut kāds, ko mēs pašreiz varam aiziet notikumā. Pēc ieviešām, pēc nopietnas tehnoloģijas, tādas cilvēks nekad bieži nesāk un vēl tādas lietas pērti, tādas laboratorijas un uz priekšām manas bērns, ka 10 mēnešus vai aizpriekšanu. Tā piemēru, kādēļ tas ir nepieciešams. Mēs ikdienās, vai mēs ikdienās 400, 500 vai kas tas ir. Tad jūs spēt iedomāties, mēs ierēķināsim pēc laika, tās ir tiešām skaržanai, tas tam ir 2 minūtes. Un ja mūsu ieprasības atkām nosacības priekšnosacījums, viņi ir aizņem ļoti daudz laika, un ļoti paši jau gadā situācija, tās līdzsūtīt, piemēram, paradzīm, kurā šos sūkņus var izmantot kaut kādo ķīmisko ieroču ražošanā. Protams, tādas preces iegādājas arī ķīmiskās ražotnes, laboratorijas, zāļu ražotāji. Taču ikdienā jūs nekur šādas lietas veikalā neieiesiet un nenopirksiet. Tas ir kā piemērs, ja jums iet sūknis, jūs varat noskaidrot, kam viņš ir domāts. Ja jūs redzat, ka viņš ir domāts tikai ūdenim un viņu izmanto kaut kur dārzā vai lauksaimniecībā, tad ne pie kādiem apstākļiem viņš neiekritīs pie divējādi lietojuma preces. Jo parastus sūkņus nekad neviens neražos no niķeļa vai titāna vai cirkonija. Tas būs pārāk dārgi un neviens tādus sūkņus vienkārši nepirks. Vēl viens piemērs ir, piemēram, optiskās komponentes. Jūs redzat, te ir komponentes, kas ražotas no cinka selenīda vai cinka sulfīda, un kurām ir konkrēti parametri tehniskie. Un jāpiemina, ka kainkods nav spējīgs identificēt cinka selenīda tādas lēcas, kuras ir tilpumā pārsniedz 100 kubikcentimetrus. Tieši tādēļ ļoti daudzām lēcām vienkārši kainkods izkritīs. Ja jums ir kaut kādas stikla lēcas, piemēram, kas ir domātas brillēm, tad jums nav jāuztraucās un jāpārbauda viņas pie mums, jo tās lēcas mēs izmantojam ikdienā. Tās ir domātas tiešām, lai redzētu. Viņas nekādā veidā nevar izmantot militārai ražošanai. kā piemēram šīs lēcas tieši ir domātas militārai ražošanai, tāpat laikā arī priekš civilās ražošanas, ja mēs runājam par ļoti augstvērtīgām civilām tehnoloģijām. Teiksim, šīs lēcas ir ļoti izturīgas, un viņas izmanto priekš kamerām, kuras ir domātas, piemēram, kādiem droniem vai satelītiem, viņas iztur augstu temperatūru un tam līdzīgi. Tikai tādēļ viņas jau var uzskatīt par stratēģiskām un tādām, ko izmanto militārai ražošanai. Lai jūs vispār saprastu, kādā veidā to sarakstu mēs izveidojam, tad viņš veidojās no 4 dažādām starptautiskām organizācijām. Tās ir brīvprātīgas organizācijas, kurās ir kā nu kurā ap 50 dalību valstīm dažādām. Un šos sarakstus taisa tiešām eksperti, kas ir eksperti savā jomā, kas reizi gadā sanāk visu kopā un izvēlās tad tehniski, kurā brīdī kāds priekšmets pēc tehniskiem parametriem jau būs stratēģisks. Tā viena no grupām ir Austrālijas grupa, viņi strādā tikai ar ķīmiskiem un bioloģiskām vielām. Viss tas, ko var izmantot gan civilā rūpniecībā, gan viss tas, ko izmanto bioloģisko un ķīmisko ieroču ražošanai. Tas ir tiešām preces, kuras vajag gan civiliem tirgum, gan militāriem. Preces, lai šo kodolstaciju apkalpotu. Lai viņa funkcionētu, lai viņa strādātu, tie būs dažādi reaktori, tie būs grafīta stieņi, kas nodrošina reakcijas enerģētiskās. Bet tajā pat laikā, jebkura civila kodola par militāru tikai tādēļ, ka tās izejvielas, kas rodās civilai elektrības ražošanai, viņas jau var izmantot militārām vajadzībām. Tas ir iemesls, kāpēc tur ir saliktas savas tehnoloģijas, kuras būtu jāuzmana attiecībā uz kodolietām. Vēl viena grupa ir atšķiršu tehnoloģijas grupa. Tur atkal ir tieši tas pats divējādi lietojuma preces vajadzīgas tieši atšķiršu ražošanai. Un pēdējā ir vasarnāras vienošanās grupa. Tā ir atkal ar tādām precēm, kuras nepieciešams, lai ražotu gan civilās, gan militārās preces jau konkrēti. Ejot cauri sarakstam, šis saraksts sastāv no 10 dažādām kategorijām, un vienkārši tā īsumā apskatīsimies, lai jums būtu skaidrs, kas tur ir iekšā. Tad 0. kategorija sastāv tikai no lietām, kas vajadzīgas kodola ražošanai. Tur būs viss, kas ir nepieciešams kodola reaktoriem. Dažādi sūkņi, kas spēj izturēt radiāciju, dažādas iekārtas, pat ja tie ir kabeļi, kas iztur radiāciju, tad viņš tajā brīdī varētu būt šajā kategorijā. Šeit, protams, jāpiemina, ka runa nav par radioaktīvām vielām. Ir reizes, kad cilvēki domā, ka radioaktīvā viela automātiski skaitās stratēģiski. Tad tā īsti nav. Radioaktīvs var būt arī jebkāds dzelzs gabals, kurš ir atradies kādā radiācijas zonā, un viņš vienkārši kļūst radioaktīvs. Šeit mēs runājam jau par lietām, kuras vajadzīgas, lai ražotu kodolpreces. Un, ja mēs paskatāmies uz tiem pāris punktiem, protams, tas nav viss, kas sarakstā ir minēts, bet paskatoties uz tiem punktiem, ticiet man, jūs to neko nenopirksiet, ieejot veikalā. Tādas lietas ražo tikai uz pēcpasūtījumiem. Nākamā kategorija jau ir materiāli un iekārtas. Ja tā paskatās uz to sarakstu, viņš ir diezgan loģisks, jo, ja jūs gribētu saražot tanku, piemēram, jums ir nepieciešams, kas jums vajag materiāls, jums vajag iekārtas rūpniecības, jums vajag darba gaudus, kas kaut ko virpo frēzē, tālāk jums vajag elektroniku, tālāk jums vajag vadības sistēmas, datori sistēmas. Un principā tas saraksts sastāv no tāda liela komplekta, kas ir nepieciešams, lai pašam sāktu ražot militārās preces, piemēram. Tālāk pirmā kategorija jau ir vairāk runa par tikai materiāliem un ķīmiskām dažādām vielām. Viena no lietām, ko mēs ikdienā pārbaudam, ir antibiotikas, medicīnas preparāti Un tas viss ir ļoti lieki un nav nepieciešams sūtīt uz pārbaudi, jo vienkārši nekad dzīvē nevieni medikamenti nav bijuši ne sankcijās, ne stratēģiski. Pat ja medikaments nāk ar kaut kādu ļoti jocīgu nosaukumu.
There are also different funny definitions. I suggest that the businessman can just Google it and look what things are. There are different chemical names for different objects. You can call water H2O. You can call different types of medications by using the names of chemical substances. And some people don't find it very clear. But by Googling, you can just figure out whether this is a medication intended for humans or for animals. And if it's a medication, then don't send it for a check because there is no risk. Speaking of different metals, every metal is being controlled considering the particularities and where it can be used. There are different powders such as aluminum, which can be used in rocket fuel. This is why they are controlled. Even if you see aluminum powder, quite often it won't be for dual use because it has to be a perfect sphere, every grain. This is necessary for good burning reaction because you know that all the rockets are using these types of fuel. No one is using diesel for rockets. There are different liquid gases or different metal powders. But you shouldn't worry about a regular iron. Quite often, different types of stainless steels sent for verification, stainless steel or iron, and then the verification is quite excessive because iron is not used for military purposes. This requires titanium, nickel, aluminum, something like that. Quite frequently, clothing is set for verifications, gloves, boots, but clothes can be strategic only if it's used for chemical production, for example. So you need special type of clothing in order to protect yourself from chemical substances, from chemical gases. And only this type of clothing is considered to be dual use. Any item of clothing which has no particular defense against chemicals, if it's not protected against gases, maybe a gas mask, it cannot be strategic. In chemical production, regular types of clothing will be used. Another category, metal processing. Here we are discussing different types of equipment necessary to perform actions. What is being sent for verification? Equipment for wood production. I assure you, neither party is so hard up for military goods to begin to use wood for military purposes. Wood is wood, and any type of equipment used for wood treatment cannot be used for military purposes. So here we can only discussing extremely precise machinery used for metal. The link to military production is very clear. If we produce, for example, bicycles, these details need to be very precise because we are going 30 kilometers an hour on a bicycle. And with these types of vibrations and speeds, the mechanical details can be imprecise. It's impossible to produce things to perfection. There will always be some kind of a 1 millimeter deviation. And here we are speaking about the control of those types of tools and equipment that can produce to extremely high precision, 1/1000th of a millimeter. This type of equipment is extremely expensive. It's equipment that is not being produced in China, for example, because China does not have the technology to produce this type of machinery. We won't be able to go over all the categories, so I'll move on to different images because the images will illustrate what dual-use objects look like. The first thing that you need to remember, you needn't send for a verification objects for daily use. They have never been strategic. One example, a workbench. These types of workbenches are frankly very big. They can be as big as a room. They can be transported by multiple trucks. But what does this type of equipment do? It creates precisely made items. If you are making items for military goods, you cannot afford to use details with mistakes because a vibration which is created when the not precisely can be detrimental. This is the reason why different hand tools, hand drills, different saws are being checked, sent for verification to be checked. Because we are only controlling the workbenches that are highly precise. You needn't worry about hand tools because no military factory is going to use hand drills or hand saws for military equipment. Another example, an isostatic press. This type of equipment is not even a press in itself. It's more like an oven. And you need it in order to create very big details without seams. For example, bicycle frames are being welded in some places, and there the point of joining is the place where potential defects can occur. If you need something to be very resilient, it has to be whole. You cannot compose it out of multiple elements, glue it together, weld it together, because these are potential vulnerable points for defect. This is why such ovens are being used. Such furnaces, you can create a very big detail of composition. Another example, vibration testing machine. We cannot buy them in shops. You really need to know where to find one, where to get one. They are being used to check from operating with the course, the detail or functional, and for example, vibrations at 11 kilometers is something to be checked for purposes. Another example, centrifugal separator. We are controlling them because they are necessary to use with biological agents. If you are an institution producing biological weapons, you need this type of equipment. Looking at these images, you can clearly see that these dual-use objects are not objects for daily use. We don't see them day to day. We cannot buy them freely. And you need to send for verification just everything that you can see where you spot a potential risk. Another example, a protective suit. This is a type of clothing for dual use. It protects you from regular chemical substances like smoke, gas, chemical origin. It can also protect biological weapons and even nuclear radiation. So only this type of equipment can be of dual use, and I think it costs 15,000 per unit. So the price is also a criterion which can suggest the item is for dual use. Here is an example of a biological safety cabinet. Those are for pharmacy companies. These are completely sealed chambers where you can securely work with different viruses and biological agents. At the same time, biological safety cabinets can be needed those who want to use biological weapons. Spray equipment. This is not an example of something that is controlled. This is just a general example. This is a general spray system. Spray equipment can be used to spray water or fertilizers, but it can also be used to spray fine chemical weapons. So if we want to use a chemical weapon, we want to kill or the harvest, it's an economic threat, it's a chemical attack, leave the country without harvest. In order to do that, you need these types of spraying aerosol equipment. Another example, a block of graphite. We know that graphite is used to produce pencils and also fishing rods, but also graphite can be used to create graphite rods for nuclear plants. So here you can see that military use. If you see graphite blocks, you can safely send them for verification to make sure that this is something to be done. Another example, microchips. Most of them are made with silicon, but those that are made with gallium arsenide are controlled. That's something of interest for Russia and Belarus. In many examples, we see that the rockets are using Soviet-era microchips, so those rockets are not very precise and they cannot fly at the necessary distances. Another example, dual-use unmanned aerial vehicles. If you work with them daily and you know that it can be of dual use, if can fly for longer than 1 hour, or it can be flying for more than 30 minutes, and is capable of surmounting 46.3 km/h wind gusts. There can be dual-use items on the basis of technical specifications, but there are also other things. Of course, we know that KAMAZ is a heavy-duty car that it can be used to transport milk or sand, but at the same time, the spare parts of these cars can be used for military purposes. KAMAZ parts can be used for militaries in general. They can be used to transport military equipment. So if there's a spare part being sent for use in a military model, then you can demand a license. I see that my time is running out, so here are a few examples of items that may attract special attention. They are fairly simple, but they have been sanctioned because technologies that can be used for the military will feature a number of goods subject to licensing. One of the items, electronics, chips, diodes, transistors of all kinds. If you're working with electronics, you should be prudent because a lot of it can be banned. So it's possible, please avoid taking on such cargoes. spare parts for ships, including yachts and even motorboats. You can identify these items yourself. We can tell you that these things are subject to licensing. It does not matter whether the boat is civilian or military use, we need to have a permission. Diving equipment, all kinds, ship navigation equipment. One of the items that can be frequently sent through Latvia, routers and servers. I'm not referring to switches for home use, which are being used to provide internet in the households. This applies to business-grade routers, larger scale routers, which can be used to make telecommunications for the whole company. These types of things can be found in lists, servers, routers, you can send them for checking. Frankly, lately I don't see very many shipments of these types of equipment. Optical telecommunication cables and spare parts for heavy vehicles. We are going to control spare parts for heavy vehicles if they are intended for vehicles with a load capacity exceeding 9 tons. This applies to a wide range of parts, and if you are in the business of transit or export or movement of spare parts, please take into account that these items can be in the sanctions lists. One thing that you shouldn't send for verification is spare parts for light vehicles. You only review them by pricing in specific sections of the list. Next item, gas detectors and also seismological equipment. All sorts of explosives, even civil, are banned. So proton, TNT, all sorts. Microscopes, chromatographs, spectrometers, and 3D printers. Please be mindful. This does not apply to plastic 3D printers. It applies to additive manufacturing devices or metal 3D printers. Now that would be all from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I await your questions should you have them. Thank you very much, Nauris, for telling us about these complicated matters in an understandable way. I have no extra questions from Nauris right now, but Saiva has answered the previous questions on Slido. I will pass on these answers to the listeners. One of the questions asked was, if a company buys metal goods from Russia and sells them to Turkey, is it a violation of the sanctions? The correct answer is that Article 3G of the regulation forbids a direct or indirect purchase of steel from Russia. So yes, in this case, the Latvian company violates sanctions. There was also a question regarding TransCapital Bank. Can the Latvian company receive assets being sent in euro? The answer is that Latvian financial institutions will not process the payments from banks included in OFAC lists, not in euro, not in dollars, not in anything. Regarding repair works in EU docks and ports for vessels with Russian flags. Please take into account that with very few exceptions, ships with Russian flags cannot be docked. If a specific ship has the permission to be in the Latvian or other EU ports, then it can be repaired. Now we'll give the floor to our next speaker, who's going to talk about the role of sanctions and the role of the customs in enforcing them. I hope you can hear me. My name is Dr. Imberga. I'm head of the restrictions and prohibition monitor of the risk management division of patients. And I'll talk about these actions against Russia. What's the competence of the customs unit and what are our challenges, because we do have them. And I'll share a few of the questions that we frequently asked. Please keep your questions for the moment, because perhaps in the course of my presentation, I will already answer them. The main competence of the customs is sectoral sanction. This applies to the import or export of goods in the scope of the Russian sanctions. These are the goods we can count all the lists. The regulation of sanction is not directly linked to the definition. So import and export is not something that is normally meant with these words. Incoming transit and exit. And there are no exceptions to natural persons. Sanctions apply to luggage and mail. But before we move on to that, I invite you to say yes to reading the regulations. Why? Because all the conditions, all the exceptions, and the general picture can be found in the regulation text. And everyone can find information regarding their goods and services. Now, a few words about the things that we are controlling. This is a simplified overview of the regulation, what is being restricted, what cannot be exported. In both regulations regarding Russia and Belarus, the deadlines for contract are indicated. For example, when it comes to aircraft spare parts, the deadline has already run out. What happens in this case? Exports are not allowed. The customs declaration will be rejected. Then there will be an assessment whether criminal liability arises here for the attempt. When it comes to imports, you see the same conditions regarding the completion of contracts. I won't list all the codes because it will take ages. There are frequent questions about the letters X. What does it mean? If you don't know, this means that this group of goods is subject to regulations with some exceptions. So you have to read carefully, you have to review annex or the technical. There will be all the information regarding what these prohibitions apply to. The fifth round of sanctions brought additional conditions regarding the transportation for vessels and road transport. Was a great challenge for us because we have borders with Russia and Belarus, and cars are crossing the border quite a lot. This prohibition has exemption for regular mail. Belarusian mail is delivering mail through mail, and there are also exemptions for transit between Russia and Leningrad Oblast, but this only applies provided that the carriage of such goods is not otherwise prohibited under this regulation. There are exemptions provided for Russian vessels and Russian transport, but right now that does not apply because we do not know who is the authority that can decide on the application of exemptions. There is a condition, a necessary condition. If, for example, the receiver is in Germany, we should be able to understand that these exempt goods are truly necessary for the German market. So right now we are not applying sanctions. Now, when it comes to Belarus, the latest round of sanctions has quite a lot of items. I will give a very general overview because the restrictions for road transport apply to Belarus as well. The exemptions are provided for mail. I would like to add that when it comes to diplomatic cargo, we apply exemptions because the mission provides information how the permission is going to be formatted, how it's going to be passed on. How are we controlling? The customs make selections and referrals as automated as possible, so we access contract, origin, other features. If something is not clear to us whether the goods are sanctioned, we solicit additional information. In case of a breach of sanctions or suspicion of a breach of sanctions, the customs procedure is not allowed to be completed, the call is rejected, and a criminal offense is assessed. Another customs procedure may be applied because important goods are just rejected back to the country from which they are put in. You can also send it back to China. We cooperate with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the assessment of dual items. And we cooperate with the National Security Services and other authorities, including EU Customs Services. There's a very active exchange of information regarding the rejected cargo, and we are monitoring the onward movement of goods to make sure that no circumvention of sanctions occurs, that the owners are not changed, but that everything can be tracked down. Sources of information. For the customs, the main source of information is the customs declaration and the accompanying documents. But additional information can be requested, and an important additional source information for sanction is our tariff system. Those who work in import-export are familiar with this system. Most likely they are using this system. They know what is written there. For those who perhaps don't know the matter very well, I have chosen one of the codes to provide an illustrative example. What do we see here? This is the specific code from the group. We know that group 44 from Belarus is banned. All the codes with the first numbers before are now under sanctions. We see the country, and here we see where are the conditions of sanction. There is an indication in which article we should look for the conditions. The conditions section enables us to see whether there are exemptions. Here we see that there are exemptions applying to specific contracts. And finally, you can examine the regulatory enactments. There is a link. You can click on it and find the relevant article. I would like to say that sanctions are just one measure that have to be verified, because there are also other things to be done: external control, connection with parties, cesium presence, and so on. So a lot of points need to be reviewed. What are other additional sources? Specific laws. Here, Eurolix is our best friend, particularly the function to find consolidated regulatory actions. Of course, in the beginning, it was fairly difficult because they had to read everything separately, but right now it's all right. You can find the latest amendments very easily. I invite you to look up the sanctions on the webpage of the Ministry of Affairs. There are also frequently asked questions. We do have included a section regarding the restrictions and prohibition for the movement of goods. The very general information is available. I remind you that you need to look for the information that is relevant to you and your type of products in the integrated tariff management system and in the regulation itself. What are the challenges for the customs? Main challenges arise from the fact that right now the customs role is not defined in national legislation. Obviously, working with goods is directly related to our duties, but the large volume of goods subject to sanctions impacts our work. We cannot check everything automatically, manually necessary, and customs is of course spend a lot of time verifying deadlines. It creates additional stress. We don't know who the competent authority is, because there are some places in the regulation where it's clear who the competent authority is. Sometimes it's not. These verification procedures are important not just on the border, but also during the import procedure. Right now, we have been late for 3 days, and this creates resentment, but I invite people understanding we cannot prevent us. We're trying to redirect our employees, but we cannot decrease the number of checks necessary, so to do everything, even though the checks weren't used. What are the current uncertainties? Yeah, I've highlighted only the most fashionable things. Conditions of contract. There are a lot of contracts which need to be fulfilled, and to the end, there is a great desire to prove that the contract was indeed signed before the date specified, but it's not always true. The subject matter and price are essential items of the contract, but date and place of the delivery are not essential elements. If the subject matter and price are changed, we are considering this an essential element, and if the additional contract is concluded for a new price and new subject item, we consider it to be a separate contract. For quicker results, please add the contracts. If you have contact with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs regarding the dual items, and you have the decision of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, please add it to your customs declaration. Don't wait for the customs to invite you to do that, because when you wait for the customs to invite you to submit additional information, you just get into the second view and you have to wait again. I also draw your attention to the fact that customs does not grant exceptions for road transport or port calls by Russian-flagged vessels under the sanctions regime, because speed of the receiving country for the category of goods is not known by us. That would be all from me. I tried to touch upon the most general matters, give you a general overview of the way customs work right now with this vast scope and volume of goods which have fallen under sanctions. Thank you very much for your exhaustive presentation. And if there are no questions from the audience on this matter, we'll continue with our next speaker, member of the board of your bank, Igor Petrov. He is going to share his insights regarding managing the risk of sanctions in companies. Thank you. I represent the bank and the Financial Industry Association, but today I would not like to speak as a banker. I would like to share my vision how the sanctions management procedure can be created in companies. We have had experience in creating internal mechanisms in different frameworks, and I hope the experience and vision will be useful to you. This is not the only way in which this control can be created, but it is a way. When I started my career in the domain of sanction compliance, this was back in 2002. Sanctions were a mystical matter. North Korea, Cuba, it seemed very detached from reality. But in 2014, I made an error in my presentation. I meant 2014. There were different sanctions pertaining to different sectors. They played an increasingly important role regarding business with Russia. In June last year, after the Belarusian elections, there was a large sanctions against Belarus. And of course, for all of us, 24th February 2022 is a very tragic date, a very meaningful date. It has impacted all of our lives. Many feel it now already. Many will be feeling it in the coming days. Life has changed, the rules of the game have changed, and the business environment has changed, particularly when it comes to import and export Russia and Belarus. I understood the viewpoint of businessmen. I was able to do that because for you previously, sanctions used to be intangible. Then it became more and more tangible, more and more familiar. Payments are not coming in, partners are asking things, a lack of information. Right now, perhaps we have even too much information, so many seminars, so many lectures, so many clarifications, questions and answers. We're being flooded with this information. It's very interesting, it's very significant. But what is the most important thing? How can we navigate this information? I will try to offer you a way in which we can create a form of management of sanctions risk. Saiva, in the beginning of our event, mentioned the article on 5 steps. It's a very good article. I invite you to read it on the webpage. And it all boils down to a systemic approach and documenting the matters. Risk assessment, decreasing risk, or avoiding risk, systematizing necessary information, verifying your business partners and other involved parties, and verifying goods. Let's start with the systemic approach. Few sanctions arrived in our lives very quickly. They brought a lot of change, and they won't go away anytime soon. EU regulations on sanctions are usually adopted for 12 months, but nothing will happen after 12 months. Perhaps there will be some changes. There might be even harsher measures. There might be milder measures, depending on the situation. But going forward, there won't be a way when all the sanctions are just up and cancelled. The sanctions are adopted until they are called off, and this means a longer period of time awaiting positive change. So managing the risk of sanctions is not a measure for a single day. You think about it, note it, and you move on. There are going to be new sanctions. There might be lessening of sanctions. There might be new partners coming in. Working with them, you need to check for the risk of sanctions. Maybe you need to introduce changes to your existing partner structure. Maybe there is a change of ownership. You need to change who the new owners are, who the beneficiaries are. Are they under sanctions? Of course, your business is developing, and you'll have the opportunity to look for new directions, new opportunities, but be mindful of the risk. All people in Latvia, all businessmen registered and located in Latvia are subject of the sanctions. We need to observe sanctions. It applies to all of us. Now, a few words on the documenting process. Even if you have a wonderful understanding of the sanctions and you can manage sanctions perfectly, you can avoid paying first partners, choose only the good ones, secure goods. But if you don't have documents proving that, it means you have nothing. So I invite you to have a more bureaucratic approach. I know that nobody likes bureaucracy, except maybe banks, but they don't like it very much either. Sanctions require bureaucracy in order to function. So I invite you to document everything that you do. Please document how you manage the risk. I don't suggest that you need to write long documents for strategic policies if it's not something that's a feature of your business. You don't have to buy external document packages if you don't plan to implement it in practice. That's useless. I suggest that you write on a piece of paper what are your steps to manage the sanctions risk of the company. What is your risk assessment? How are you going to assess your partners? How are you going to verify the good? What goods require permission from the ministry? And keep these documents archived. Be ready to show these documents when there's an auditor or a financial institution asking for them. Risk assessment. Companies might have different exposure to risk. If you have a store that is buying products in Latvia and selling them only in Latvia, then perhaps there is no risk. But if you are involved in international trade, particularly with Russia and Belarus, then it's a risk. And transporting, moving the goods is also quite a hassle right now. So you need to have an assessment of potential risks that these operations fail. It's a logical operation. Write down who your partners are, who are high-risk partners, depending on where they are located, what are the risk product categories. Maybe out of 100 items that you sell, you have just one that requires a permission from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You need to provide some sort of assessment, and you need to document. And of course, after the risk assessment, the next important thing that you mustn't forget is considering how you can decrease your risk. For example, if out of 100 items, only one is subject to risk, maybe you should just drop this item. If out of 10 partners, you have one who is from a sanctioned country, but you can find an analog partner in the EU, maybe there is no point in creating a complicating system, thinking whether you'll be able to make payments, whether there will be additional complicated procedures in the customs. Maybe you can just drop this partner. I think no one expects that in the very near future there will be any improvement in the sanctions. I'm sure there will be new rounds of sanctions, and it will become increasingly more complicated to cooperate with these countries. So we invite you to assess whether you can give up on these risky transactions. It's not always possible. Should this be impossible, maybe you can decrease the risk by decreasing the number of partners, increasing the movement of goods. Because the less cooperation you have with these countries, the better it is for your business right now. What else can I say? Regarding the systematization of useful information, during this seminar, you have heard a lot about the sources of information on sanctioned persons, the owners and beneficiaries of businesses from Russia and Belarus. And I'm sure that you have already heard a lot during previous seminars, you have found information in other articles. Just try to systematize the information you have available. No one single seminar is going to provide you with an answer that is perfectly tailor-made for your business. We're trying to cover a wide range of topics. You will most likely have one specific question that you would like to focus on, and I invite you to try to find a question that is useful to you in particular. Please put this information down in a journal document or in an email at least. So when you have a new partner coming in, you don't need to start all over again. You immediately have all this useful information in a single checklist that you can immediately use. More about this useful information. The sanction search engines are very interesting tools, as mentioned in the presentations by my colleagues. There are different aggregators. There are legal companies aggregating and publishing information. There are different articles, for example, in Delphi. I invite you to start by reading the regulation, because that is the original, that is the source, that is the source of all the restrictions. It determines who is doing things. You can find all of the codes in the regulation. Latvian legislation suggests who is liable and so on, but the codes, these specifications, they can be found in the regulation. I invite you to read the regulation in order to assess whether your transactions, whether your partners are subject to the sanctions. The EU regulations are available in all the official languages of the EU, but I suggest that you read it in English, because sometimes there are issues with the translation. Of course, you can read in Latvian as well. verifying your business partners and other involved parties. I think we have spoken enough on this matter, but I would like to remind you that you should write down who your partners are, with whom you cooperate, figure out where they're registered, where they have their bank accounts, or whether it will be possible to continue bank transactions with them, whether their banks have fallen under sanctions. Check who are the true beneficiaries of these companies, who are the shareholders. Are the shareholders on the sanctions list? And I also invite you to regularly, because you can check your partner, and then a while later they sell their company to a person who is under the sanctions. So you should document how frequently you perform your checks. When it comes to checking the goods, the procedure is the same. You know what types of goods you're working with, which are the goods without any restrictions, which are the goods with restrictions. Permission from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is necessary for those categories. You know all that. Working with your partners, you need to be mindful as well. When they are from sanctioned countries, please document the dates for your contract signings. This is something that is quite topical. When there is a new round of sanctions, new restrictions for imports from Russia and Belarus, there is a transition period to complete the obligations for old contracts. But it does not mean that you are going to conclude an agreement and sign a contract backdating it. No, don't do that. And if you are working with Russia and Belarus, keep a register where you note the dates, and you should have a mechanism for verifying it, maybe electronic signature, so you can prove to the customs that it was truly an old contract, that you are not trying to squeeze in a new contract with some backdating scheming. It's not a matter of trust or a lack of trust. It's a matter of risk management, risk assessment, and decreasing the risk for all parties. What are you going to gain if you create a system to manage the risk of sanctions? Of course, first and foremost, you're going to manage the risk more efficiently and save your time and money. You won't be afraid that you'll potentially violate some sanctions. Your business activities always entail some repetitive actions. There are processes that you repeat time and time again. And in that case, it's good to have it tailor-made and well planned from the start. Determine who is the responsible person, determine what is the procedure, do it once, and you'll have the sanctions period covered. You have to adapt to the changing circumstances, new rounds of sanctions, maybe lessening of some sanctions eventually. Maybe you'll change the geography of your operations, you'll have two partners, you'll begin working with products. Having a document and the system is going to help you in all these actions. It will also decrease your dependency on people, because you will have one specialist who knows all about sanctions. This is a risky situation where you depend on one person a lot. Potentially, risk management system will improve your relationship with your partners and state institutions. Of course, even if you have a perfect management system, it does not guarantee that your bank will allow you to do everything, but it will surely help you to maintain a good relationship with your bank. And if we refer to the darker side of things, if you have accidentally violated sanctions, maybe you have a new partner, you check everything, it seems fine, you have the transaction, and then 2 days later, you find out that they changed shareholders. The shareholder is now on the sanctions list, so you have violated the sanctions. In this case, if you see that you have a risk management system, you see that you made a mistake, it will help you to decrease the negative consequences. These are very elementary measures, but they are helpful, and I'm sure that a lot of you have already worked on developing such a systemic approach, and you can learn things by doing. That would be all from me for today. If you have any questions, thank you very much for your useful suggestions. There's one question. I will ask it again, even though it goes back to other matters. Is a Lursoft notice enough to check the state of your partner? I would say that in the case of sanctions risk, you should go deeper. Test the waters more carefully, figure out who is the owner, who are the shareholders, and try extra hard to check all the information. Thank you. In case the sanctioned person owns few shares in the company, should we drop operation? In case the person can control the operations of the company, so they are a member of the board and a shareholder, then we should terminate the relationship. If the share is insignificant and other persons are on the board, it depends on your risk appetite. You are not obligated to terminate relationships, but think about it on your own. Another question, luxury goods bought from China and sold in Russia. Are the sanctions applicable in this case? Yes. Since the company in question was founded in Latvia, the ban to export luxury goods to Russia is applicable to this Latvian company who buys in China and sells in Russia. Thank you, Igor. And now we give the floor to the next speaker, Edvards Grasis, who is a risk management at Preču, who will be sharing his insights into supply chain and cooperation partner analysis for the import and export. Yes, I would like to give you a theoretical overview of the things that should be done. How we can examine the situation with the clients, what are the risks? Igor has just said that you need to create a risk assessment document. I will try to outline what are the main points and how we can examine the situation with our cooperation partners. There are 4 key elements for the standard. Clients and cooperation partners, the risks that are typical for them, considering the legal form of investments, geographical risks, related to the location and supply chain. Then specific goods and services. And the distribution channels, risk related to payments and using intermediaries. It's important to assess the risks that are not just related to direct suppliers, but also other participants of the supply chain, intermediaries, providers of payments, and other parties. This is related not just to direct sanctions, but also the risks of circumvention of sanctions. As regards the risks, what are the main principles? The main idea is that we need to figure out what are the principles of cooperation, legal form of property ownership, economic area, verified sanctions list, and accessing topical information about the cooperation partners. Is there any negative information available? These are the main points we should figure out. If any type of public information is available about the financial situation, the area of operations, reputation, and it decreases the risk. And if the public information is not available, it increases the risk. It means that it's more difficult to make sure who is behind the partner. What should we identify during our cooperation? Please look not just on a very superficial level, what is the economic operations, but try to gain detailed information about the cooperation partner. What are they doing? The first step, sanction check, sanction screening, look into the lists, check for compliance. If you see that the person is not on, no persons are on the sanctions list, you can move further. See how the client organizes their economic or personal operations. What is the place of economic operations? They have accounts in other financial institutions, other opportunities to sell your goods. Do you have information how many employees they have, the infrastructure? Is it possible to buy or sell these types of goods? This can be very relevant to figure out whether your partner is truly your partner or it's just an intermediary and someone is hiding behind them. What is the activity or the previous periods of economic operations, the turnover, profits, partners? Does the client have a special license? Do they have a cooperation history? Does it comply with the general understanding of operations? An additional risk factor would be if we're a recently founded company with a large volume of import and exports. This might be a way to hide the true cooperation partner. And if you see that something is unclear, that there are some contradictory aspects, then ask for additional information And maybe you can decide not to cooperate with this partner. Perhaps the financial institution or state institutions will ask for information about these cooperation partners anyway, so it's good if you have it in advance. This is related to different regulatory enactments, the matter of geographical risks. You need to figure out whether the direct restrictions are applicable in the jurisdiction's question. And moving on, perhaps the jurisdiction has a border with another jurisdiction subject to the sanctions. Neighboring countries, the countries that are neighboring Russia and Belarus are potentially risky partners because there might be goods circumventing the sanctions. So goods are being sent to these countries with the aim to further sell them. Another important matter is if the jurisdiction has a border with a sea border, a maritime border with a jurisdiction subject to the sanctions, not just a land border. This increases the potential risk. Therefore, so as my colleagues have said, there are different ways in which the sanctions can be avoided, and you have to make sure that you don't fall for these risks of your partner's potential trying to circumvent the sanctions by using you. All of these things are extremely relevant. What are the principles for the assessment of geographical risks? It entails different elements. For example, you can have a company in the EU, but it has a connection with another country. You can observe the scheme on the slide with potential risk factors. I advise you to be as prudent as possible right now. You have to be more careful, and please document all the matters. What should you describe as diligently as possible when you are performing the geographic risk assessment? Look for the registration, location of the client, the jurisdiction of their activity, the usage of a bank account. Is there a connection with other jurisdictions bordering the sanctioned countries? Perhaps a scheme to circumvent the sanctions is being planned by other parties. Is there a land border or a maritime border? Is the import and export of the specific goods typical for the geographic location in question? Is it likely that these deals are being made in good faith? or this is something that is used to resell potentially the goods to the sanction countries. What are the principles for risk assessment of goods and services? The assessment of risk factors allows you to identify the deviations from the typical activity. And you should try to figure out whether the provided products and services are linked to the economic operations of the client. It's linked with the dual use of product or military sphere place. Is your cooperation regular? What are the conditions of operations? Are the types of goods and services specified? What are the volumes? Does this comply with the mode of delivery? Check who are make payments. Check whether the sums involved in the deals are uncharacteristically high. No signal.
Turpin mūs ik pa laikam vajāt. Pagaidīsim, kamēr Edvards atgriezīsies tiešraidē.
Unfortunately, technical issues continue to plague us. We'll wait for Edgar's to come back. I remind you that the recording will be available on the web pages of our organization and of our partners. You'll be able to review the record and you'll be able to download the presentations. You'll be able to use them. As a number of our speakers have highlighted, it's very important to follow all the latest changes. Of course, it's very difficult to follow all the latest information. This is why we organize these seminars, and as soon as we have latest updates, we'll try to bring them to your attention. If you spot something and you notice that there are no clarifications, bring it to our attention. In a cooperation with our partners, we'll try to provide you with all the latest updates and explanations. I remind you that the recording of this broadcast is going to be available in English, so you are welcome to share it with your cooperation partners in order to discover the aspects of sanctions application in Latvia. Also, it would be good practice to share these insights with our neighboring countries. We have discovered that there can be some minor practical differences in the way the sanctions are being applied in practice. The practice is not homogeneous in all of the EU, and we see that in Latvia there is a lot of interaction of different stakeholders to make sure that that's happening. Looks like we'll be able to get back to Edward's presentation. Thank you very much for listening to this technical information. Edward, please continue. Yes, I hope you heard me. For some reason, Zoom refused to cooperate with me. I'll continue. Where was I? You have to review your low-risk operation partners in order to make sure that there truly is no risk. Be prudent and perform an initial risk assessment for everyone. As regards high-risk areas, see whether the goods and services potentially refer to the risky areas. this applies to dual use and military use products, and I think our colleagues from the state institutions have a great detailed overview of that. The connected industries with a heightened potential risk are of importance. Please examine the connection with each of them. You have to understand what is the origin of goods and services. Think about the final receiver, whether the delivery costs are too high compared with the value of goods. Perhaps there are attempts to circumvent the sanctions to pay off someone involved in the scheme. Look at the size of the goods, whether their type and volume correspond to the profile of the supplier, the receiver, and see whether there are substantial differences in the customs documents. What are the risks pertaining to the distribution channels? A direct cooperation model is preferable. The involvement of third parties is a potential risk factor. When they come up in product distribution, different intermediaries, third parties, this is potentially risky. Payments to third parties who are not contractual parties, this is not something you should allow. You need to be clear who you're paying to. You need to clearly know where you are delivering to. Cash or virtual currencies are potential risk factor. Transfers to or from financial institutions which are subject to sanctions. All of this relates to the risk of eventually circumventing sanctions. Using third parties and the involvement of third parties in cooperation heightens the risk and need to examine it in depth. When it comes to assessing the distribution channels, it is important to focus on the involvement of third parties and intermediaries in the deals or organizing them. Are there any deals with third parties or in their interests? And are these third parties subject to sanction? Are there any payments, deliveries to such parties? Are third parties involved in planning the deals, the payments, and delivery? What are the payment and supply channels? And are there any discrepancies between the origin of goods and the receiver of financial assets? Now, about the general risks. As I have mentioned previously, it is very important to identify high-risk factors and to provide good quality documentation necessary for analysis. If you are missing something or you cannot prove something in writing, then you cannot prove that the risks are being understood and managed. The most typical approach is to ask for documentation and to assume that if something has not been documented, then it has not been done. So you should really work on your documents in order to be able to prove what has been done. You have to identify the risk factor pertaining to the client, what type of goods these are, what's the origin of the client, what actions were performed in order to assess the risk factor, what type of information and documentation was obtained pertaining to this factor, were there any other additional factors lessening the risks? And finally, what was the final decision regarding the risk factor and the measures to be taken? Here is an illustrative example. A low risk factor client. You'll understand that the client is not related to any risk areas, so you don't need to analyze the risk in detail. Then if the client has a high risk factor on the additional steps, the good track here would be is if you have a high risk factor client, you perform a risk factor analysis, you get the additional information, and the information that is available publicly is positive. So the risks pertaining to this client seem to be understandable and manageable, and you can move forward. But you can have another example when the client is a high-risk client, you perform a risk assessment, you don't have sufficient information, the publicly available information is positive, but in order to fully understand the risk related to this client, you need extra documentation. So you should ask for extra information from this partner or institution. Another scenario, you have a high-risk client, you made an assessment without analyzing the specific risk factor. So you should analyze the risk fully. Another more practical example, potential risk of sanction, because the goods are being exported to Russia. You assess the results of the sanctions check. You see no compliance. You don't find compliance in the list of sanctioned persons. You document that the person is not subject to sanctions. You document what you have done to make sure of that. You keep this information in writing about your cooperation partners in Russia, legal information, publicly available information, information obtained from the specific cooperation partner that justifies your assessment of the client, the goods and services. Risk lessening factors, revised financial reviews prepared by the client, long-standing cooperation with the client. This testifies to the reliability as determined by the assessment. So this potential sanction risk does not yield potential sanction violations, but you need to review the changes and the compliance in goods and partners regularly. And this also includes the supply chain. In conclusion, a few bad practice examples. The actions you perform are not based in risk. For example, you ask for the same information from all of your cooperation partners, regardless of the risk and of the de facto beneficiaries. If you ask the same of others, maybe you are not really asking about the actual risk. So your general request for information does not cover the actual needs. So it gives you, as a result, unnecessary information and does not give you the necessary information. You should focus your activity on the actual areas of risk. Another example of bad practice, trusting the clarifications from the client. You have clarifications, but you don't have the documents to prove it because your cooperation partners can be different. They can be telling you all sorts of things. They can be writing on the web page all sorts of things. If you have no external review, particularly when it comes to heightened risk factors, these are insufficiently elaborate risk assessment procedures, and they are not enough. Another example of bad practice, relying on uncorroborated information too much. This is something that can be told by third parties, friends of the client. Your sources are lacking credibility, and the information has not been verified. Trusting unofficial sources and web pages is not good practice. And another example of bad practice, taking information does not comply with the business profile of the client. If something happens that does not comply with the general operations profile of the client, for example, they suddenly change their type of economic activity, they're changing the turnover of the partners, they are beginning the new types of the business, they increase the volume of transactions, get new supply chain. This is a potential red flag that you need to draw your attention to. You shouldn't just assume a very general way that it's fine. If up to now your cooperation testifies to a certain type of activity from their operator, that they are working within a geographical area, and then suddenly you see this big change, don't assume good faith. Overall, that would be all from me. I have tried to sketch out the most important factors, how you can review this control system. I would like to underline that it's very important to review the situation with your cooperation partners and to assess all the risks. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer. I'm sure that your presentation has yielded useful advice. There are a few questions. If we bought goods from a sanctioned entity before the sanctions came in force, how can we return them? It's a very technical question. I think it depends what exactly happened. Was it delivered a long time ago, before the sanctions were applied? If there is some overlap between the delivery periods and transition periods, then you should examine every situation in great detail to figure out what was going on. I wouldn't like to give you a general answer. It is something that requires a specific analysis of the specific situation. Thank you. I also remind you that in order to make financial transactions, special permissions are also needed to pay for the goods. Another question, also not very specific. There are about 500 cooperation partners. Do you have any advice about regular checks for these cooperation partners? So here we have a lot of partners. Yes, 500 is a substantial number. You should think about potential automatization of the process. If something can be automated, maybe an automated check of the sanctioned lists. If there is, for example, an automated solution from Lursoft, that should be a useful tool. Maybe this is something to think about. This step would be automated to the point of getting computerized alerts if there is a positive match with the sanctioned list, and this should make the process easier.
You
should also think about your risk scope and your risk appetite. So what is a standard business as usual for you, and what is something that is out of standard? Think about the risks and make sure that they are not too high. Examine the situation on an individual level. These would be the main points of advice when you're working with a large number of partners. Thank you, Edward. This was the final question from the audience. I would like to thank all the speakers and all the listeners for their undivided attention. I also remind you that the recording of the broadcast and the presentations will be available on the webpage of our organization and our partners. The current situation in the domain of sanctions is obviously a matter of midterm and long-term. We will have to be following it, manage our risk appetites, and figure out how we can protect our business and our operations from different types of risks, including in the domain of sanctions. We harshly condemn the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, and we hope that we will be able to return to a peaceful situation, that at one point sanctions will no longer be relevant because we'll have peace and security. Thank you very much, and see you.